Twisted Fate. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The rain pelted down in relentless sheets, a harsh symphony against the cracked windows of the decrepit apartment. John Marshall, a man whose life had been defined by routine and predictability, sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the envelope that had been slipped under his door just an hour ago. The envelope was black, the paper thick and smooth, contrasting sharply with the mundane world John had built around himself. John hesitated, his hand hovering over the envelope as if touching it would somehow unravel the carefully constructed life he had maintained for so many years. He had always been a man of simple pleasures, a person who avoided conflict and strayed from anything remotely exciting. But this envelope, with its peculiar weight and unnerving presence, seemed to pull him in, a siren's call in the stormy night. Finally, he reached out and tore open the seal. Inside was a single card, elegant in its simplicity. "Congratulations, John Marshall. You have been selected to participate in the game. Your first move must be made within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate disqualification." There was no signature, no explanation, just those cold, precise words. John's heart began to race, a sickening feeling of dread settling in his stomach. He flipped the card over, hoping for more information, but it was blank. What game? Why him? Questions flooded his mind, each one more desperate than the last. For a moment, he considered throwing the card away, pretending it had never arrived. But a strange curiosity gnawed at him, a need to understand what this was. He stood up, clutching the card, and began pacing the tiny apartment, the sound of the rain outside a dull roar in his ears. Just as he was about to set the card down and dismiss the whole thing as some elaborate prank, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. With a deep breath, he answered. "Hello." His voice wavered slightly. "John Marshall." The voice on the other end was smooth, almost hypnotic. "Welcome to the game." John's grip tightened on the phone. "What is this? Who are you?" "All in good time, John. But for now you must make a choice. On your kitchen table there is a knife. Pick it up." John turned his head slowly, eyes widening as he spotted the knife lying next to the card. He hadn't noticed it before. Trembling, he reached out and grasped the handle. "Now, John, the game is simple. You will receive instructions and you must follow them. Failure to do so will result in consequences, fatal ones. Do you understand? What do you want from me?" John's voice was a mixture of fear and frustration. "Survival, John. The game is about survival. Your first task is to go to the address on the back of the card. There you will find your first opponent." "Opponent?" John's head was spinning. "I didn't sign up for this." "Oh, but you did. Every decision you've ever made has led you to this moment. Now it's time to see if you have what it takes to win. Remember, John, the clock is ticking." The line went dead. John stood frozen, the knife heavy in his hand. He flipped the card over and found an address scrawled in neat, black ink. Panic surged through him, his mind racing with possible escape routes. But something deep inside him knew there was no way out. He was already a player in the game, and the only way forward was to play. With a resigned sigh, John slipped the card into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the pouring rain. The city streets were deserted, the night air thick with the promise of danger. As he walked towards the unknown, John couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just been irreversibly changed. The game had begun and there was no turning back. Chapter 2. The First Move. John's footsteps echoed through the empty streets, each step a countdown to whatever awaited him at the mysterious address. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the cold, damp air still clung to him, seeping through his clothes and into his bones. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, feeling the weight of the knife in his pocket, a constant reminder of the bizarre and terrifying situation he had found himself in. The address led him to an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, its windows shattered and doors hanging on rusted hinges. John hesitated at the entrance, the darkness inside seeming to pulse with a life of its own. He could turn back now, walk away and forget this nightmare. But the ominous words of the voice on the phone echoed in his mind, and he knew that was no longer an option. Taking a deep breath, John pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of damp concrete and decay assaulted his senses, and he had to fight the urge to gag. The interior was just as desolate as the exterior, with debris scattered across the floor and broken machinery lying in rusting heaps. But amidst the ruins there was a single light, a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow on the ground below. In the center of the light stood a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face hidden in the shadows. As John approached, the man stepped forward, revealing cold, calculating eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. He was dressed in black from head to toe, a stark contrast to John's disheveled appearance. "John Marshall," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "I'm your first opponent." John swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I don't want to do this. I don't even know what this is." The man smirked. "You don't have a choice. The game doesn't care about your wants or needs. It only cares about who survives." With that, the man lunged at John, his movements quick and precise. John barely had time to react, pulling the knife from his pocket and raising it in a feeble attempt to defend himself. The man's fist connected with John's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded in his head, and for a moment he saw stars. "Get up, John," the man barked, circling him like a predator. "You're going to have to do better than that if you want to stay alive." John staggered to his feet, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, a nightmare he would wake up from at any moment. But the pain in his jaw, the cold metal of the knife in his hand, they were all too real. The man came at him again, and this time John was ready. He sidestepped the attack and slashed out with the knife, catching the man's arm. A thin line of blood appeared, and the man hissed in anger, his eyes narrowing with newfound respect. "Not bad," the man said, his voice tinged with approval. "But you'll need more than that to win." They circled each other, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. John could feel his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline flooding his veins. He had never been in a fight before, never even thrown a punch, but something primal was taking over, something that told him he had to survive no matter the cost. With a roar, the man charged at him again, and this time John didn't hesitate. He plunged the knife into the man's side, feeling the blade sink into flesh and muscle. The man gasped, his eyes widening in shock and pain. For a moment they stood there, locked in a deadly embrace, before the man slumped to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. John stumbled back, the knife slipping from his fingers. He stared at the man, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just done. The man was dying, his life slipping away with every shallow breath. And John had been the one to take it. Before he could process the horror of his actions, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands and answered it, his voice barely above a whisper. I did it." "Good," the voice on the other end said, cold and detached. "You've made your first move, John. But the game is far from over. Prepare yourself because things are about to get much, much worse." The line went dead, and John was left standing in the darkness, the weight of his actions crushing down on him. He had just taken a life, and he knew that there was no turning back now. The game had begun, and he was in it for the long haul, whether he liked it or not. Twisted fate. Chapter 3. The second player. John stumbled out of the warehouse, his hands still stained with blood. The reality of what he had done weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had no time to dwell on it. The voice on the phone had made it clear. This was only the beginning. The cold night air hit his face, and he tried to steady his breathing, forcing the nausea down as he made his way back to his apartment. By the time he reached home, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective. John felt a surreal sense of detachment, as if he were walking through a dream. No, a nightmare that refused to end. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, each one screaming for attention. But the one thing he knew with certainty was that he was trapped. There was no escape from the game. As he entered his apartment, the darkness inside felt oppressive, closing in around him. He flicked on the light, and for a moment the familiar surroundings brought a fleeting sense of comfort. But then his eyes landed on the black envelope sitting on his kitchen table, a new one identical to the first. John's stomach churned as he approached it, a sinking feeling in his gut. His hand trembled as he picked it up and tore it open. Inside there was another card, this one with the same elegant script. "Well done, John. But the game waits for no one. Your next move is crucial. The second player is waiting." Below the text was another address, different from the first. John stared at the card, his mind racing. He had barely survived the first encounter, and now he was being thrust into another one. But what choice did he have? The game had rules, and he was bound by them. He grabbed a quick shower, scrubbing away the grime and blood, trying to cleanse himself of the horror of what he had done. But no amount of soap could wash away the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. Dressed in fresh clothes, he pocketed the new card, slipped the knife back into his coat, and set out once more into the night. The address led him deeper into the city, to a rundown motel that looked like it hadn't seen a decent guest in years. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the dilapidated building. John hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at him to turn around, to run far away. But the game had already ensnared him, and there was no escape. Inside, the lobby was empty, the air thick with the stench of mold and stale cigarettes. A single light bulb buzzed overhead, casting a dim light over the peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. John approached the front desk, where an old man with sunken eyes and a greasy comb-over sat, flipping through a tattered magazine. "Room 23, John said, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure why he said it, but something told him that was where he needed to go. The old man glanced up, his gaze sharp and unnerving. Without a word, he reached under the counter and slid a key across the desk. John hesitated before picking it up, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The hallway leading to room 23 was long and narrow, each step echoing off the walls. The doors on either side were closed, but John could feel eyes on him, as if unseen watchers were tracking his every move. When he finally reached the door, he paused, the weight of the key heavy in his hand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever awaited him on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the faint sound of a television in the background. As John stepped inside, he saw her, a woman sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. She looked up at him, her expression hardening. "You're the next player," she said flatly. John nodded, his throat dry. "I don't want to do this." "Neither do I," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But we don't have a choice, do we?" She reached under the pillow and pulled out a small pistol, her hand shaking as she held it up. John's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the knife in his coat. They stood there, weapons drawn, locked in a silent standoff. "What's your name?" John asked, trying to buy time to think of a way out of this madness. "Emily," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't ask for this. I was just trying to survive." John could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at his insides. They were both trapped, pawns in a game neither of them understood. He took a tentative step forward, lowering the knife slightly. "Emily, we don't have to do this," he said softly. "There has to be another way." She shook her head, her grip on the pistol tightening. "No, there isn't. They're watching us. If we don't play, they'll kill us both." John glanced around the room, his eyes darting to the corners, searching for cameras or hidden microphones. But the room was empty save for the two of them. "Emily, please," he urged, taking another step closer. "We can figure this out together. We don't have to fight." For a moment it looked like she might lower the gun, that she might see reason. But then a sharp click echoed through the room, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through John. The door had locked behind him, sealing them both inside. Emily's eyes widened and she let out a sob. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She squeezed the trigger. Chapter 4. The confrontation. John barely had time to react. The gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the small room. He dived to the side, the bullet whizzing past his ear, embedding itself in the wall behind him. His heart pounded in his chest as he hit the floor, rolling to the side to avoid a second shot. "Emily, stop!" he shouted, his voice laced with desperation. But she was already pulling the trigger again, her face twisted in anguish. John scrambled to his feet, ducking behind a worn-out armchair as another bullet tore through the air. He could hear Emily sobbing, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "I don't want to do this," she cried, her voice breaking. "I don't want to die." John peeked out from behind the chair, his mind racing. He had to end this, but he didn't want to hurt her. They were both victims, caught in the web of a cruel game that demanded their lives. He had to find a way to disarm her, to make her see that there was another way. But then he saw it, the glint of metal in her hand, the way her fingers trembled as she aimed the gun at him once more. She was terrified, but she was also determined, driven by the same primal instinct that had taken hold of him in the warehouse. "Emily, listen to me," John pleaded, his voice low and urgent. "We can fight this. We can find a way out together." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, we can't. They won't let us. They'll kill us both if we don't play by the rules. John's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to reach her, to convince her that they could escape this nightmare. But the reality of their situation was undeniable. The door was locked, the room a trap designed to force them into confrontation. And the only way out, the only way to survive, was to win. His grip tightened on the knife, his knuckles white with the effort. He didn't want to hurt her, but he knew that he couldn't let her kill him. He had to survive. The voice on the phone had been clear. There was no mercy in the game, no room for hesitation. Emily took a shaky step forward, the gun still trained on him. Her eyes were wild, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Please, John," she whispered. "I don't want to die." John could see the fear in her eyes, the desperation that mirrored his own. He knew that she was just as much a victim as he was, but in that moment she was also his enemy. He had to make a choice that would determine not only his fate but hers as well. Time seemed to slow as they stood there, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. John's mind raced, weighing his options, searching for any way out that didn't end in bloodshed. But the truth was inescapable, one of them had to die. Emily's finger tightened on the trigger, her resolve hardening. John saw the decision in her eyes a split second before she acted, and his instincts took over. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. The knife in his hand felt like an extension of his own body, a tool of survival that he wielded with grim determination. He aimed for her hand, hoping to disarm her, to end this without taking her life. But Emily reacted faster than he anticipated. She twisted to the side, the gun going off just as John's knife sliced through the air. The bullet grazed his shoulder, a searing pain that sent him reeling. But he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He brought the knife down in a quick, controlled motion, striking her arm and sending the gun clattering to the floor. Emily screamed in pain, clutching her wounded arm as she stumbled back. John kicked the gun away, his breathing ragged as he faced her. Blood dripped from his shoulder, the wound stinging with every movement, but he forced himself to stay focused. "It doesn't have to end like this," John said, his voice raw with emotion. "We can find another way." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and fear. For a moment, John thought she might relent, that she might see reason. But then her expression hardened, and she lunged at him with a feral scream, her nails clawing at his face. John was caught off guard, stumbling backward as she attacked with a desperate fury. His back hit the wall, and he struggled to fend her off, his hands grappling with hers as they wrestled for control. Her strength surprised him, fueled by a terrifying mix of fear and adrenaline. In the chaos, John's grip on the knife faltered, and he felt it slip from his hand. Emily's eyes locked onto the weapon, and she lunged for it, but John was faster. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it with just enough force to make her cry out in pain. She fell to her knees, her strength finally giving out. John stood over her, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The knife was within reach, but he couldn't bring himself to pick it up. He couldn't do it, he couldn't kill her. "Please," Emily whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't." John hesitated, his mind torn between survival and mercy. He knew what the game demanded, but he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he took her life. But before he could make a decision, the door burst open, and two figures in black suits stormed into the room. They moved with military precision, grabbing John and pulling him away from Emily. "Enough," one of them barked, his voice cold and authoritative. "The game is over." John struggled in their grip, confusion and fear swirling in his mind. What's happening?" The man holding him sneered. "You've both failed. The game doesn't tolerate weakness." John's heart sank as he realized what they meant. They weren't here to save them. They were here to finish what the game had started. He looked at Emily, who was sobbing uncontrollably, her face pale and bloodied. They were both going to die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The man holding John nodded to his partner, who pulled out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "Time to end this." John's mind raced as he struggled against his captor, but it was no use. The needle plunged into his neck, and within seconds, darkness consumed him. Chapter 5. The Revelation. John awoke to the sound of a steady beeping, his mind groggy and disoriented. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like he was wading through thick mud. His eyes fluttered open, and he found himself staring at a sterile white ceiling, fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare. The beeping was coming from a monitor next to the bed. His bed, he realized as he blinked away the haze of unconsciousness. Panic flared in his chest as memories of the game flooded back. The blood, the fear, Emily's tear-streaked face. He tried to sit up, but his muscles refused to cooperate, weighed down by whatever sedative they had used on him. As his vision cleared, he saw that he was in a hospital room, the kind of place where people went to heal, not where they woke up after being forced to play a deadly game. The stark contrast made his heart race, confusion and fear battling for dominance in his mind. The door to the room opened with a soft click, and a man in a crisp suit entered, his demeanor calm and professional. John's eyes narrowed as he recognized him. One of the men who had stormed into the motel room, the one who had injected him with the sedative. "Good to see you're awake, Mr. Marshall," the man said, his voice devoid of warmth. He approached the bed, his hands clasped behind his back, giving John a look that was both assessing and indifferent. "Where am I?" John croaked, his throat dry and scratchy. "You're safe," the man replied as if that explained everything. "The game is over." John's mind reeled. Safe? After everything that had happened, how could he possibly be safe? He tried to sit up again, but the man raised a hand, signaling him to stay down. "Rest, Mr. Marshall. You've been through quite an ordeal." "Ordeal?" John spat, anger flaring in his chest. "You made me kill someone. You made us." His voice cracked, the memories of Emily's terrified face flashing before his eyes. The man's expression didn't change. "You misunderstand, Mr. Marshall. The game is not about killing. It's about testing." "Testing?" John's voice was laced with disbelief. "Testing what?" "How far you can push someone before they break." The man's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "Testing your will to survive. Testing your resilience. The game is designed to find those who have the strength to endure, to face their darkest fears and emerge stronger." John stared at him, his mind struggling to process the cold logic behind the man's words. "And what about the people who don't survive? What about Emily?" The man's eyes darkened slightly, but his tone remained even. "Everyone who enters the game knows the risks. It's not for the faint of heart. Those who fail to survive, well, they were never meant to make it." John felt sick. The casual way this man spoke of life and death, as if people were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard, disgusted him. "Why me? Why was I chosen?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to reveal. "You were selected because of your potential, Mr. Marshall. You have a certain quality that made you an ideal candidate. The game is not random. It is meticulously planned, and every participant is chosen for a reason." John's thoughts raced. He had been a nobody, just an ordinary man living a dull, routine life. What kind of potential could they have seen in him? "You have questions," the man continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "And in time you'll get answers. But for now you need to rest. The game may be over, but your journey is just beginning." Before John could protest, the man turned and walked toward the door. "Someone will be by soon to check on you. Try to relax." The door closed softly behind him, leaving John alone with his thoughts. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what was this journey the man had mentioned? He had so many questions, but deep down he feared the answers. Whatever this game was, it was far from over. The sense of relief he had felt upon waking up began to dissolve, replaced by a gnawing dread. As the beeping of the monitor droned on, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was still trapped, still a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The man had said he was safe, but John knew better. In the world of the game, safety was an illusion, and the real danger was just beginning. Chapter 6. The final move. The following days were a blur of doctors, nurses, and endless tests. John answered their questions mechanically, his mind still reeling from the events that had led him to this hospital bed. They ran scans, drew blood, and monitored his vital signs, but none of it made sense to him. Why all this medical attention after such a brutal ordeal? Despite the physical recovery, John felt no peace. The hospital room, though clean and quiet, felt like another cage, a place where he was watched, monitored, controlled. The staff were polite but distant, and any attempts to ask about the game or why he was there were met with vague reassurances and deflections. It wasn't until the third day that something changed. John was sitting in his bed, staring out the window at the gray, overcast sky, when the door to his room opened. He turned, expecting another nurse or doctor, but instead, a woman entered, her presence immediately commanding his attention. She was tall and poised, dressed in a tailored suit that exuded authority. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, and her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the room and of John. "Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice smooth and controlled, "I'm glad to see you're recovering well." John eyed her warily. "Who are you?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "My name is Claire. I represent the organization that conducted the game." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want?" "I'm here to offer you an opportunity," Claire replied, taking a seat in the chair beside his bed. "You've proven yourself, Mr. Marshall. You survived the game, something few people can claim. And because of that, you've earned a place with us." John frowned, trying to process her words. "A place with you? What does that mean?" "It means that you have a choice," Claire said, her tone businesslike. "You can return to your old life, forget about the game, and move on. We'll ensure that no harm comes to you and you'll never hear from us again." John's eyes narrowed. "And the other option?" She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "Or you can join us, become part of something bigger than yourself. The game was just the beginning, Mr. Marshall. There's a world out there that most people never see, a world where power, control, and survival are the only things that matter. With us, you could have all of that." John's mind reeled. "Join you? After everything you've put me through, you expect me to just sign up?" Claire's smile was cold. "You've already proven you have what it takes. You're a survivor, John. But surviving isn't enough. We need people who can thrive, who can rise above the challenges and become something more. That's what we're offering you." John stared at her, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, anger, and confusion. The idea of returning to his old life was tempting. He could leave all of this behind, pretend it never happened. But he knew deep down that he could never go back. The game had changed him, and there was no escaping that reality. "What if I say no?" John asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Claire's expression remained unreadable. "Then you'll be free to go. But know this, Mr. Marshall, once you leave there's no coming back. You'll be on your own, and we won't be able to protect you from the consequences of your choices." John's heart pounded in his chest. Consequences. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications he didn't fully understand. He had survived the game, but at what cost? And what awaited him if he chose to stay? He took a deep breath, his mind racing. The fear that had gripped him for so long was still there, but now it was joined by something else. A burning curiosity, a desire to understand the forces that had brought him to this point. He didn't want to be a pawn anymore. He wanted to know the truth, to take control of his fate. "What happens if I say yes?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire's eyes gleamed with something that looked like satisfaction. "Then you'll be initiated. Train. You'll learn the rules of the game, and eventually you'll become a player in your own right. Someone who can influence the outcome, not just survive it." John considered her words, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life avoiding risks, living in the safety of routine. But that life was gone, shattered by the events of the past few days. Now he had a chance to step into the unknown, to embrace the darkness and see where it led. Finally he nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm in." Claire's smile widened, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Welcome to the real game, John." She stood and extended her hand. John hesitated for only a moment before taking it, sealing his fate with a single, firm handshake. As Claire left the room, John felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but now it was tempered by determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he was no longer the man who had started this journey. He was a player now, and the game had only just begun.